Respected Dr. Manmohan Singh ji, Professor Indu Banga, Professor Rakesh Batabyal, and the author Priya Atwal, my colleagues Dr. Ravel Singh and Dr. Madhuri Chawla, and many friends who have joined us online, including Dr. Manmohan Singh, the scholar statesman. This makes us nervous, but also gives us great encouragement that our President, Dr. Manmohan Singh, is watching online this discussion. Friends, as you know, Bhai Veer Singh Sadan was founded in the memory of Bhai Veer Singh, the saint poet. And later, Institute of Punjab Studies was set up with the help of scholars and statesmen. Dr. Manmohan Singh, the chairman. Professor Indu Banga was on the governing body, Professor Garewal, Professor Bipin Chandra, Dr. Amrit Singh, who were able to do some good work. Now, two of our activities are to discuss a good book every month and a lecture on a relevant topic. This month's book is by Priya Atwal, Royals and Rebels. And this month we'll be having a lecture by Sonia Dhami of the Sikh Foundation from USA on Guru Tegh Bahadur in different paintings. Now, talking about the book is the privilege of the two distinguished panelists, Professor Banga and Professor Rakesh Batabyal. The author, Dr. Priya Atwal, has joined us. After a while, Dr. Madhuri Chawla, the moderator, she'll introduce the book, the author, and the two panelists. If you permit, I like to take 3 or 4 minutes to talk about my reading of the book. Now, I liked the way Priya concluded with the popular folklore, Iksi Raja, Iksi Rani, Dono Marge Khatam Kahani. But this kahani, this story doesn't end with the end of the Maharaja and his many Ranis, 30 of them, I think. Maharaja lives in popular memory in 3 Punjabs, the Pakistani Punjab, the Indian Punjab, and Punjab of the diaspora. I like to share with you how much respect Maharaja commands even now in Pakistani Punjab. Many years back, I went to Pakistan and went to this Lahore Fort Museum. You know, among many exhibits, there's a stuffed Lally, the favorite horse or maybe mare of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. I noticed an old Pathan with his grandchildren bowing before the Lali, touching the Lali, and they are stopping him. Mende Maharajani Kodi, the horse of my Maharaja, Menda is my. Look at how much respect they had for the Kodi. And then, if they have that reverence for the horse of Maharaja, you can imagine the reverence for the Maharaja and his Rani. Rakesh provoked me to read more about it. And after Priya's book, I also read Chitra's novel about Maharani Jinda. And general feeling is that Jinda has been generally ignored. It is partly true. In England, the Queen commands more respect, more attention than her partner who passed away recently. Monarch gets more attention, true. But I must tell you, Priya, Jinda is not ignored. There are 23 books on Maharani Jinda. Unfortunately, they are in Punjabi. And the Western world, which is not familiar with this language, is not much aware of this. But I think I must appreciate that some of you in the diaspora, you have done some favor to us. Beginning with Michael Alexander and Shushila Anand, Queen Victoria's Dilip Singh, very moving account I read when I was in UK. Then Navtej Sarna's account of Maharaj Ranjit Singh, Chitra Banerjee, and Anita Anand. They have all written about the Maharani and Duleep Singh. Now, I quite agree with Priya that there's a bias. There's a bias in all societies. We talk of equality, real equality is a myth. Among the Sikhs, we talk of equality, but real equality is missing, it's evading. Britishers carried a typical mindset that Asia was half civilized, they had come to civilize us. So this impression they carry in their writings about Ranjit Singh and Maharani Jinda. I read from Priya from your book, while talking about the debauchery of Ranjit Singh, they say he was gentle to his 30 wives. But about Jinda, they are very critical. And I certainly detest, hate, and condemn one comment that Sikh women, especially the Jat Sikh women, they are licentious. I think this is very derogatory. They should not. This is there about Rani Chand Kaur and others. And then again, these British administrators are wrong in their judgment that women are unfit to rule. They quite forget that at that time, they had a queen, Queen Victoria, who was ruling for a long period. She was fit to rule. Jinda is not fit to rule. That shows their racial bias, their gender bias, and biases of many other kinds that we suffered. Now, just for Priya's attention, we have a memorial for Ranjit Singh, the Samad of Maharaja Ranjit Singh in Lahore. Every year, a Jatha of pilgrims goes. This time, they haven't been allowed because of coronavirus or some other reasons. So there's a memorial for Ranjit Singh. There's a memorial for Duleep Singh in Elevated Estate, but there's no memorial for Jinda. We all know she was quietly cremated in Nasik. Maybe this occasion we can use to float a new idea that we should have some sort of memorial for Maharani Jinda in Nasik, where she was cremated, because we cannot have access to Pakistan or UK. With these small comments, I like to say sorry I've trespassed into the area of the panelists, Professor Banga and Rakesh Batabyal, and now invite our moderator, Dr. Madhuri Chawla, to introduce the book, the author, and two distinguished panelists who have joined with us in spite of their busy schedule. And I respectfully again welcome Dr. Manmohan Singh, who has been to all of us a great source of encouragement. Thank you. Over to Madhuri.
Thank you, Dr. Mahendra Singh Ji. You have given us a very comprehensive overview of the book already. But a very good afternoon to the panelists and the audience who have logged in with us today for this book discussion session. Especially a special warm welcome to Dr. Manmohan Singh Ji, who has, I learn, also joined us. Before we begin, gratitude to the Almighty that we have sailed through the second and an extremely fatal COVID wave, and prayers for all those dear ones we have lost to this deadly virus. But as they say, the show must go on. We move ahead with our discussion today on the book Royals and Rebels, The Rise and Fall of the Sikh Empire. This book has been authored by Dr. Priya Atwal on behalf of National Institute of Punjab Studies, Bhai Veer Singh Sadan. I extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Atwal and also to our panelists for the day, distinguished historians, Professor Indu Banga and Professor Rakesh Batabyal. We also welcome Professor Rakesh Singh, convener of Punjabi Advisory Board, Sahitya Academy, who is ever so supportive in all our programs and events. It's a delightful opportunity for me to moderate a session on this page-turning book for such an esteemed panel, and I am extremely thankful to the Sadan for providing me this opportunity. the relevance of the book can be fathomed from the fact that so many noteworthy magazines, journals, and dailies like the Wall Street Journal, the BBC History Magazine, LSE Review of Books, Art Mag, Brown Girl Magazine, to name a few, and established historians and authors and broadcasters like Dan Snow, Anita Anand, as Sir mentioned, and pop culture host for the Washington Post, Hannah Jewell, Shashi Tharoor, distinguished professor, University of California, Pashora Singh, and several others have spoken highly of the book. If one were to pen down the main attributes or the main tenets pointed out by eminent scholars, one may say that the book is a path-breaking one, an intricate masterpiece, a tour de force which reveals the contingencies of the past of the Sikh Empire in all its complexity, especially its forgotten but influential queens and princes. A book which portrays very authentically that the Sikh Empire was not merely about political assertion but also about culture. The book, which was originally Dr. Atwal's doctoral thesis, is a pioneering work in that it traces how Ranjit Singh was able to create his kingdom because of the foundation that had been laid down initially by the Gurus and later by his grandfather Charat Singh and his father Maha Singh. The book Royals and Rebels was first published in UK by Hearst and Company in 2020 and by HarperCollins in India in 2021. And it very tersely, in 5 chapters, presents a comprehensive account of the Sikh Empire's rise and fall, throws fresh light on how narratives are manipulated for political agendas, how there was and perhaps always is a perspective to every narrative. And Dr. Atwal makes us look at Sikh history with a different perspective altogether. The book gives voice to the, I would say, to the silences in Sikh history, to the marginalized women and their role in the making of the Sikh Empire and in the success of the legendary Sher-e Punjab. And suddenly, alongside the larger-than-life image of Ranjit Singh, also emerges a Raj Kaur, who was his mother, a Sada Kaur, who was his mother-in-law, and a Jindan Kaur, one of his several wives. And if I borrow the title of Chitra Banerjee Diva Karuni's latest book, The Last Queen. And Banerjee rightly says that while we have all heard about Rani Lakshmi Bai, about Padmavati, and female leaders like Razia Sultan and about Mirabai, many of us are not really familiar with the Sikh Queen Jindan Kaur. Well, I am no historian, and like you all, I am also eager to be enlightened by the informed and profound presentations of our esteemed panelists who would give us a more nuanced view and a different perspective of this very interesting piece of work. Our first speaker for the day is Professor Indu Banga, a distinguished historian who was Professor of History in Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar, and later at Panjab University, Chandigarh. And presently, she's Professor Emerita of History, Panjab University, Chandigarh. She specializes in history of Punjab and is author of several works published by various publishing houses. Professor Banga has delivered lectures in various Indian and foreign universities and has guided several students who now occupy important positions in the universities in Punjab. She has the rare distinction of being the General President of the Indian History Congress, the oldest body of historians founded in 1935. Ma'am, we would love to listen to you, to your informed views in detail, but unfortunately, I have to perform this unpleasant task of informing you that due to paucity of time, we will have to stick to a 20-minute time frame, and I would request you to kindly comprehend within that, ma'am, and the mic is all yours now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Respected Dr. Manmohan Singh ji, it's a great honor that I am speaking at a time when you are present. Dr. Mohinder Singh, distinguished panelists, which who include the author and friends. It's an honor and always a pleasure to be part of the programs of the Sadan. And it's a pleasure to hold this beautifully produced book, which we can all see. Now that the time constraint is there, I'll speak very briefly about a few things which I found more striking about the book, what the book has, or what the book does not have or could have. But it has made use of several sources, and the visual sources are a particular strength of this book. Having said so, I'll straight away go to the assumptions of the author. It has already been pointed out that there is this underlying assumption is that the ruling house collectively built a new kind of kingdom and royal culture to cement their power and influence. And according to Dr. Atwal herself, hers is an elite perspective. There is nothing wrong about it, of course. And then she's talking about the story of female power in the Sikh Empire and the power of the sons of the Maharaja, the young princes of the Punjab, and they contributed richly, according to her, to the making of the empire. Then, as we have already mentioned, that gender boundaries between men and women in Ranjit Singh's Punjab, according to Dr. Atwal, were actually blurred on the ground. And we all know, even if she's not pointing out, that the 18th century women also participated in political and military matters and instructed young princes like Matas Sundari and Sahib Devi, wives of Baghel Singh, Karod Singhia, Rani Sada Kaur, Ranjit Singh's mother, to whom a reference was made, Rani Sahib Kaur of Patiala, or Rani As Kaur, and so many other. And then, of course, we are focusing in this book on Mai Nakan and Rani Jind Kaur. And then the princess. Ranjit Singh is believed to have had 1 plus 6 sons, Priya? I'm not sure. Okay, so those sons were owned by Ranjit Singh, and they played, or they were made to play a conspicuous role in the political, military, and diplomatic history of the period, and for which the term dynastic colonialism has been used by the author, especially with reference to the occupation of Nakai territories of Sardar Khan Singh Nakai by Khadak Singh. I was actually wondering if this term would be valid if we consider that Ranjit Singh actually occupied the territories of nearly all the Sardars on some pretext or the other. Whether he's sending Khadak Singh, or he's claiming it for Sher Singh and Tara Singh, or he's claiming it for some other member of the family, or he's marrying the widows by Chandar Dalna, whatever the method, but he is occupying their territories. With the exception of Fateh Singh Ahluwalia, half of his territories were also occupied, but then the British intervened. The important thing to remember is that Ranjit Singh is creating an empire And in doing so, he is shedding the minimum possible blood, which is quite consistent with his general approach towards warfare, shedding of blood, or capital punishment, which he abhorred and which he never gave in his own lifetime. So this needs to be seen like this. And then Priya has made a great use of Nonehal Singh's wedding. I have no problem with that. Very good description and a very useful one too, and how Ranjit Singh regarded it as the pinnacle of his diplomatic victory when the Governor General and his entourage was present, and the kind of rituals were on display, the meaning of those rituals, meaning of gift exchanges like the dray horses or the medallion that Ranjit Singh gives in return, the language of diplomacy, which the author has very sensitively captured and talked about. And then the role of the princess, the diplomatic role of the princess. Ranjit Singh asked them to go and deal with the British officers, British representatives, and then the Governor General himself, giving them the confidence and maybe giving the impression to the British that they are his heirs and they would be taking his position and his dynasty should continue. Very good, very well done. Since we're talking about the princess, there is a reference to a manuscript on astronomy which Khadak Singh commissioned, and which is taken as an example of the sharpness of his mind by the author. I'm not very sure that we can accept this, but you have raised this point, and this point can be further examined. And then the author is in her element when she comes to the story of Ranjit Singh's heirs after his death. And of course, the sordid story of princes being killed, murders being committed, and the way in which Chand Kaur was killed. I mean, all that is there. All that is there in other books too. But what is interesting is the way she has looked at Rani Jind Kaur and her role, and she has tried to use among, I would say, by and large, these last 2 or 3 chapters are based on primary sources, which is the strength of the author. Though, of course, one could expect these primary sources to be complemented by some of the local regional sources. But of course, a good use has been made of Umdatul Tawarikh, and Ajudhya Prasad's diary, of course, is a good source. I'm inclined to agree with her that Jind Kaur was not preoccupied with avenging her brother's death, and that she would have a role in the Multan rebellion, but whether or not she fomented the Second Anglo-Sikh War is open to question. It was too big a project. And then the author could have gone into her links with Bhai Maharaj Singh. If Bhai Maharaj Singh's links could be brought out, then perhaps something more definitive could be said about this. Her reaction to Henry Lawrence's gendered manipulation of her image is very well taken. And then the use of Cunningham's evidence, which goes in favor of Jind Kaur, is, I think, it also provides a balance in this story, and that she was behind, and as a whole, it was a story of survival and ingenuity. I would agree with her. However, as she says in the beginning, in her introduction today, the Maharani is almost as valorized within Sikh history as Ranjit Singh himself, but for different qualities. If he was the Lion of Punjab, then Jind Kaur was the heroic rebel queen. I mean, it sounds very nice, but to actually compare the two would be a bit unfair in the present state of our understanding about the subject and her actual role. I mean, we might come upon more information about Maharani Jind Kaur, and we may then be legitimately saying something more, but as of now, may not be appropriate. Then she is discussing how the Sikh empire fell within a decade. Very well. And whether or not the successors, the persons were responsible, or larger forces of economics and ideology were at work. Here again, if you look at what was happening under the circumstances, given the correspondence and given the kind of thinking that prevailed in the British circles in the 1830s, and then its new orientation in the 1840s, there was up to a point an equal chance that the Punjab could stay on as a buffer, a subordinate, friendly buffer state. But by and large, the things seem to be moving towards the end of Ranjit Singh's state. And therefore, and then we also have to keep in mind that the Sikhs could be victorious in a few battles in both the Anglo-Sikh wars, but they could not win the war because of the huge difference in their resources and technology, and then so many other factors like leadership and so forth. So probably Ranjit Singh's empire, placed as it was on the fringes of medieval and modern periods of Indian history, was foredoomed to end the way it did, or more or less the way it did. And then coming to the role of the Khalsa Army, we might recall, you don't refer to Dr. Fauja Singh's book after Ranjit Singh. He does go into this detail of the 40s, year by year, maybe 6 monthly basis. But then he says that the last year of the let's say 44, late 44 to late 45 was the period when the Khalsa Army was like a national army, neither before nor after. So this could be an effort at resurrecting the late 18th century or the 18th century kind of situation. We might say that, and some of the British observers are also saying that. Then coming to the role of the Dogra brothers, I was a little surprised that Dhyan Singh figures only with reference to the death of Chet Singh. Whereas if Naunihal was being projected as the second ruler or Khadak Singh as the heir apparent, then Dhyan Singh was the Raja-e-Rajgan prime minister virtually in the last decade of Ranjit Singh's rule. And we can't really understand what was happening without reference to Dhyan Singh. And there again, we have to make a distinction. Dhyan Singh, who was not the eldest, Gulab Singh was the eldest, Dhyan Singh number 2, Suchet Singh number 3, and that these brothers were not necessarily pulling together. And they were thinking of their self-interest in different ways. So it's not that it was Dogras versus the Sikhs. Then another small point, I'm looking at Dr. Chawla and my watch together. You made a reference to Halemi Raj, Guru Arjan's use of the phrase in the Sri Rag, very valid, absolutely fine. And then you also said that Ranjit Singh used a small golden throne, which was more like our muda, the cane muda that we usually have in villages. And then you look at his relative informality of the Darbar and the use of the term title Singh Sahab. Then we also should remember that Sarkar-e-Khalsa not necessarily refers to Ranjit Singh all the time. And this is, I think, very important, he did not formally assume the title Maharaja. This is said for 1801. And the Punjab government made a huge celebration of his assumption of the title Maharaja for reasons best known to you. I'll not go into that. But there is no contemporary evidence. There is no reference in Ganpat Rai's or Sohanlal Suri's account. And no other contemporary is actually saying, contemporary. Amarnath may say was writing 30 years hence. No contemporary is saying that he actually assumed the title Maharaja. The first reference to the title or the first reference to him as the Maharaja occurs on the door frame of the Golden Temple when it was the renovated Golden Temple, which was commissioned in 1830. Thereafter, in the correspondence of the British also, he began to be referred to as the Maharaja. Till then, he is being referred to as the Raja. So we need to go into this question, and if there is some definite evidence available, we would like to change our position, certainly, no problem at all. And I might mention in passing that the princess hardly played any significant role in conquest. It was Ranjit Singh and Ranjit Singh all the way who made the conquest through all kinds of means. Sometimes he's blamed for treachery or other things, as I've said, bloodless victory and so forth. But it was he who made the conquest, and his sons were by and large proxy to that, except in case of Syed Ahmed. And that too, when there were so many other generals present on that occasion, when Sher Singh was present too. Acha ji. Okay, now to be fair to the author, it was too large a canvas. No one could have done justice to such a huge period and such a complex period. And it was, I think, a matter of great courage on her part to even think of doing that. And therefore, as she herself says, she had to depend on secondary works. But then secondary works is rather tricky, because when we depend on others' accounts and interpretations, or both, without going to the sources directly, then there is a possibility that we also repeat their mistakes or howlers. This is the tragedy of this situation, not of this work, but this situation in general. And as I could notice, you have depended very largely for this narrative, you have depended on Khushwant Singh and Patwant Singh. I used to tell my students that you give me Khushwant Singh's book and I would show a mistake on every page of that book. Not any mistake of language. He wrote beautifully. No one can do that. But the way he actually went about, with the help of research fellows and by collecting information from here and there, putting it very beautifully, but then those mistakes perpetuated. And they have crept in our account as well. So we need to be very, very careful there. Again, when we come to we had this temptation of applying a particular hypothesis of sacred kingship and so forth. Priya, you may or may not agree with me, but you were the prisoner of that temptation. So in that, then when we look at the Guru period, we must remember that Guru Nanak also talks in terms of monarchy. The ideal monarchy or bad monarchy, but he's talking in terms of monarchy. And there are at least 9 of his compositions which have a direct political import. Before we rush to Guru Arjan's or Guru Hargobind or Guru Gobind Singh's time. And then Guru Gobind Singh directly talks about sovereignty towards the end of his period. That was post Khalsa, maybe the time he sent Zafarnama to Aurangzeb, around that time or a little later. And there is no reference to Banda. He actually commissioned Banda to go to Punjab and establish sovereign rule, not to avenge the death of his sons, which Khushwant Singh says. That would be too small a matter. And then the 18th century Sikhs were motivated by the prophecy which they believed Guru Gobind Singh had made, Hanne Hanne Hon Meer, that every saddle would have a ruler. And therefore, you do make a reference to Princep in one of your footnotes. I read your book very carefully. Princess talks about 70,000 sovereigns, because every Sardar would think of himself as an independent ruler, autonomous at any rate. And this is why the 18th century understanding is also a bit, I should say, hasty. Why I say hasty? Because if you look at the 18th century, you would notice that about the middle of the 18th century, the Mughal rule ends about the middle of the 18th century. Afghan rule next 13-14 years, beginning of territorial occupation simultaneously, aggrandizement, self-aggrandizement, 70s to the 80s, and then tussle for supremacy, 80s and 90s. If you split the period into phases of this kind, then Ranjit Singh would effortlessly slip into that phase. And there again, when we refer to Khushwant Singh, Ranjit Singh ascended the throne or Gaddi or whatever in 92. When we refer to Suri, then 90. So that we need to be careful about. Though you very rightly say that 18th century was a crucible for new ideas and practices out of which the Sikh empire was forged. But how exactly that link needs to be brought out. One or two other things that you have to be very, very careful about. That is to be careful about the words and terms we use. Like, we can't use the word murder for Guru Arjan. See, this is very important. And Lehna Pai, Lehna was not a servant of Guru Nanak. And Guru Hargobind was not the eldest son of Guru Arjan. And Guru Hargobind did not construct the new Akal Takht. He just constructed it for the first time. And similarly, this problem of terminology, we may not mix the regency and reign. It was never Jind Kaur's reign. Jind Kaur remained the regent. And so would other Ranis be given their term. Or stewardess for my Nakan, or Hindu kings in Punjab. There were no Hindu kings in Punjab. The accepted usages in historical works either chieftains or hill rulers or Rajput rulers. Since we are not using Muslim for Mughals and Afghans, we need not use the term Hindu for hill rulers or Rajput rulers. Both Muslim and Hindu Rajput rulers were there. And similarly, I'm coming to the end, Dr. Chawla. We have to be a little more particular about the use of the terms like Gurmata assemblies and missal. I'll not go into the details of what I have to say about the missals. This 12 missal idea by now is a misnomer. But Khushwant Singh, Patwant Singh, and a whole host of historians would mislead you to accept that. So I would suggest you may, if you like, look up Professor J.S. Garewal's work. You do make a reference to Sikh ideology, polity, and social order. In that very book, there are 3 essays which deal with, or 4, which deal with missals. The way missal is seen in the context of the political process on the ground. Then Dr. Karamjit Malhotra's Sikh History in the 18th Century, published by the OUP. My own modest work, Agrarian System of the Sikhs, which has been reissued recently, also will have a different discussion of missal and Gurmata. So I'm sure this book is going to be so well read, I mean, so well distributed that it's going to have a second edition soon. So I would suggest that when you come to the second edition, do please have a look at these works. And a small thing about periodization as well. See, you are a historian of British monarchy. No problem there. You have tried to use that vantage point to look at this period, fine, okay. But when you do make your comparisons, you remain grounded in Indian and Punjab history. That is important. So when we use the term early modern Indian history, and starting with Akbar's time to the beginning of Aurangzeb's reign, that becomes a little too much. That was the peak of medieval period in Indian history. Early modern comes to the late 18th century in Indian history. And there too, when you come to specific regions, they have their different periodization. For Punjab, if you are looking at institutional continuity since the Mughal times, then medieval period will continue right into the 19th century, okay, early 19th century. I mean, historical specificity, as you know, is the problem. So, but having said all this, I must tell you, I read from cover to cover, and I found it was very well written. And you have added a new interpretative perspective on Ranjit Singh and his successors, and thrown up several useful insights about the last decade. I would even suggest that as your next project, if you would like, please do focus on this decade. And it would be a marvelous work if you are able to work on this. Till then, I congratulate you and you savor this book and enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Banga. You very succinctly pointed out the strengths and the gaps in the book, rising several of them primarily because of the use of certain secondary sources. Thank you for making this discussion so very interesting and rewarding. And your address was indeed very captivating. Our other esteemed panelist for the day is Professor Rakesh Batabyal. Professor Batabyal is an erudite scholar of history, and we have had the occasion to interact with him earlier as well. And I'm sure, as always, he will add to our knowledge and give us his observations on the work so that we understand it much better. An alumnus of JNU, Professor Batabyal teaches history and theories of media at the School of Media Studies, JNU. In his illustrious career, Professor Batabyal has got several publications to his credit. His book, JNU, The Making of a University, has created a new framework for the writing of history of institutions of India. The inaugural Indian chair professor at Tokyo University, Professor Batabyal, has a sustained interest in global history and is currently working on the long-term history of nationalism and communalism in South Asia. His scholarship has been recognized and awarded by various institutions like the Kansai University, Japan, Virtual Teaching Society of India, Government of Poland's Institute of Remembrance, University of Bucharest, and the University of Budapest, to name a few. On behalf of the Sadan, I once again welcome you, Professor Batabyal, and request you to enlighten us with your impressions of the book.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. And Professor Banga actually has helped me so much in the details that she knows. She's the best person, and in fact, I must congratulate Priya not only for the book, but for having Professor Banga to speak on the book and the nuances that it has. And that's what I think any scholar on Punjab, history of Punjab, or modern Indian history and early modern history would look forward to Professor Banga's comment. So in that sense, the day is richer for all of us, you know, and so there's nothing much to add to that on that count. And as Professor Mohinder Singh always does some historical correction, I think on this account also he did he corrected some historical mistake that Priya had committed, and that is not having too many Banerjees in a book on history of the Sikhs or Punjab or Ranjit Singh. Just one Banerjee, and that has nothing to do with Punjab history. But if you remove Banerjees, Himadri Banerjees or IB Banerjees, or even Chitra Divakaruni Banerjee, you are poorer. So thankfully, by having me, one Banerjee more, he has corrected that mistake of yours. You must thank him for that. Okay, so as you know, the historians first look at the bibliography and footnotes, and as Professor Banga has commented, that is our meat, and that is meat for your book too. So what I'll do is, since the details have been given, I thought of talking about the promises and predicaments of this book. Not because Dr. Priya Atwal has written it, but because it is of salience, not only for the history of the region, history of the state, but also global history, because Punjabis are global, Sikhs are global, and the idea of Khalsa is global, Khalsa aid is global, farmers' agitation has stirred the global farmers' agitation. So, the history that I feel sitting in Delhi, where the borders are sealed by Sikhs farmer and chaos has been created in Punjab for the last weekend within internal blockages. History is, we live history. So the modern Indian history where we are all located at this moment is not very, very separated from what you're writing. So today, the biggest force that fighting central kind of new Hindu image of some concocted image of a communal Hindu state is being fought in Bengal by Bengal, in Punjab by Punjabis, in Maharashtra. These are also the territories which were central to the matter, because the British is emerging from Bengal and coming to the cis-satellite states. They're standing there. Lake and Holkar coming from Maharashtra, asking Ranjit Singh to side with them. This is your book. So, story of Punjab cannot be done away by excluding Bengalis like me or Marathis like someone. So today's history, what we are fighting, a battle of history in India, and in the historic battle which is being fought, is not dissociated with what you have written. So therefore, you have a historical responsibility that we are thrusting upon you. Some people are made great by historical responsibility. So your mistakes are also very important. Your promises are also very important. And the predicaments that you are in is also very important. The first predicament is a historical predicament. You cannot have anything to do with it. And that is, the book is replete with interchangeable words like Punjabi, Sikh, Punjabi, Sikh, Hindu. So, and that is what the age was. There was no concrete identity. And yet, you in the preface itself gives yourself an identity that I'm a Sikh. I'm a third generation there. So it's not your fault. You are there. You are there. And you are looking at this and you yourself say that I'm trying to give a cultural perspective. Now, what is that perspective? We have to be very careful about. Whose cultural perspective? 19th century, early Punjab cultural perspective, your cultural perspective, cultural perspectives of historians of Indu, Banga and my kinds, or culture's perspective of something else. So that is very important historical juncture in which this book brings us to discuss. Now, what Priya has done for the larger audience is very interesting and very innovative idea. She wanted to experiment. The beauty of the book lies in first bringing the idea of spectacle. You know, being a media scholar, we talk about spectacle, and she has therefore, without saying this, advertising this, that she is giving a cultural perspective, she brings the fat Punjabi wedding spectacle into the 19th century spectacle. So wedding becomes too important, you know. And therefore, it's a beautiful, I think this book, that's why I like Shashi Tharoor. I don't think he understands Punjab much, but, and the quotation is wrong. And in fact, you change, the next edition change that, because your own book says, he quotes, he writes, he gives you the endorsement, gripping, fine. A dramatic tale of the Sikh Empire taking on the British. He never took on. Okay, so he's wrong. Ask him to change this because it falsifies your thesis. Okay, so spectacle of marriage, and particularly Naunihal saying, there are other beautiful description. I think you have done a tremendous job of giving us a kind of, without being anthropologists, giving us a thick description, as Clifford Geertz would say, of the kind of materiality, the material prosperity that the empire has to show to the world and show to itself. For you, for the audience, I'm saying, for Priya, therefore, this spectacle becomes one more of the legitimizing of the empire. It tried to derive legitimacy through the spectacle, which everybody does. In fact, this particularly at the moment when I'm talking, the government of India, I always tell my students a concept that Clifford Geertz actually devised for Balinese Hindu state in the Indonesian peninsula called theater state. So I call the contemporary Indian state as a theater state. If you translate it, it becomes a Nautanki state, you know. So theater state, but Ranjit Singh's is not a theater state. You know, it is spectacle is just one part of it. But that is your contribution to the body of knowledge, which many of us are working, but students might learn a lot of things, how to go deeper. Where it becomes much more intriguing, interesting, is your second thesis, which is your core of your argument, where maybe when you're doing the PhD, that was your thesis. That so long historians like Irfan Habibs or Indu, Banga, J.S. Grawal, everybody, and Fauja Singh, Ganda Singh, that Punjab has produced the largest legions of Punjab, Maharashtra, and Bengal. Remember these things. Without connecting these three, we cannot construct a history of South Asia. And this is what Ruby Lals and all are doing, big blunders. Okay. So you cannot disconnect. Punjab, Bengal, Maharashtra, you cannot disconnect even to understand the history and historical writing, scholarship. So therefore, your argument and the core argument of the book is wonderful argument that so far historians have suggested that the decline of the Sikh empire or Ranjit Singh's empire is due, plausibly due to the princes who could not hold on to the empire, or the weaknesses of the princes, or the weaknesses of the post-Ranjit Singh elite. This is your first argument. You extend, and by giving your argument, you suggest it is not in the weaknesses per se, but the processes of prince making that Ranjit Singh and his own father and grandfather engaged in, the processes of making princes that they employed became a kind of reason for the weakness. And these processes you have linked in with the matrimonial alliances and making those princes as following the Mughal model as something like a Jagirdar plus military ruler, a military leader plus a diplomat. This is your word in the book. So the princess has to play this role, and this is how Ranjit Singh actually employs the whole apparatus of creating an empire, which you don't say, but the logic of the argument throughout the book, therefore it unfolds that this system could not be sustained, and this becomes the reason where there's no other way that the Khalsa army or the Sikh army, Sikh army could be controlled, which become autonomous, and this system that Ranjit Singh has employed had no connect with this. So this is our logic, that it's a valid logic which historians can go on debating, discussing. The problem with this is partly Indu Banga, Professor Banga has indicated, partly is that we are, and this is here the predicament of a new kind of universe of knowledge has emerged in the world today. On Indian history, similarly on Romanian history or Bulgarian history, there is a knowledge world which exists outside the physical boundaries of those areas. In a globalized world, you cannot do. So Chicago, Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, they create another. And Pune, Chandigarh, Amritsar, Jalandhar, Hisar, Stephens, this create another kind of body of knowledge. Quite often they meet, most often they don't meet. And what is happening now, and this is the most tragic thing, is that South Asian historians, South Asianists, as they call themselves, are talking among themselves. And a new echo chamber has been created with Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard. So they talk among themselves, and you are the second generation of that. So you have inherited that kind of echo chamber knowledge, which has not talked to a historian in Patiala or Amritsar or Delhi. And you saw the small specimen in 20 minutes where a whole alternate book was presented. No, so this is what actually created a problem for you. It's not your problem. It's a predicament. Because the second issue of that, where the system of princes as being Jagirdar, military and diplomat, which Ranjit Singh has perfected, could not stand the time or taste the time when the British were there. The problem in that is when we're talking about Mughals, that phase is over, because at least 100 years gap. And here at the border, British is there. And Ranjit Singh, in fact, he was lucky that he could go to Haridwar because he had to take permission from British resident. He could go to Haridwar for the Kumbh Mela. Thank God, because this year Haridwar has created a panic for all of us, and it is a kind of super spreader of pandemic. So no, in that sense, Haridwar is so crucial, not for other things. So Now, British is there. So the logic of that apparatus is not actually historically also being in that effective. The second, you have added to that, in fact, to your own logical development of the argument, you have brought in the dynastic colonialism. You know, the idea that is applied by a Dutch couple for the Orange, how or the House of Orange and Nassau develop itself, encouraged and expanded itself. So, as in the process, Indu Banga also noted it, that Ranjit Singh, if you have talked about the, you use the concept very, and you know, in one thesis you maximum have 2 or 3 concepts which can be operationalized. I think this concept of dynastic colonialism, which you have operationalized, the way pre-Ranjit Singh, the family tried to matrimonially or acquiring, so a dynasty, which a family becomes a dynasty and the dynasty becomes colonial. It's fine. It's fine. So far as this concept that you're using is a descriptive category, is a describing what happens. In that, Professor Banga's criticism is also you can respond to. Okay, Ranjit Singh, did this, he did not do violence and all, he did not commit too much of violence, but it expanded. And colonialism also means sometimes expansion, colonization of forests, colonization of this. But for a modern Indian historians like me and many of us here present, colonialism is not merely a descriptive category. It is an explanatory category. If there was no British, Ranjit Singh or Ranjit Singh's princess or Rani Jind would have stayed. They would have fought. They would have gone. They would have expanded into Bengal. They would have gone here. The British were there. So a colonial presence. So if I accept as a reader, as a conscientious historian, if I accept your argument, which every historian wants others to accept their argument. So in that sense, suppose I'm ready to be a follower. Who doesn't like to follower of a British historian? Be or that too. So I suppose I become a follower of your argument. Then I have a problem. Then every small dynasty or family which had fought against each other in India will be called colonial. Therefore, the uniqueness of British colonial enterprise is diluted, and this is what Oxford has been doing. Anil Seals and his his line of successors, including recently one Oxford historian writes a pretty book, 200-page book, edited volume, and what is the title? The height of arrogance. It says cultural history for India. Imagine. So if I accept your argument, then I have to accept all those arguments. There's nothing called distinctly colonial British enterprise, because Ranjit Singh also colonial, Holkars are also colonial, Shivaji was colonial, and Aurangzeb was colonial. So there's nothing, and it helps those guys who are saying British and foreigner are the same. So from 1200 to today, we are all ruled by foreigners, so we'll have an indigenous rule now. So even that argument get bolstered. Therefore, I have to fight with you on this, because I don't want those guys saying the British and Muhammad Qasim and Gori were the same. For me, British were separate, and it needed to be seen as separate. So given that, there's a beautiful logic that you have, and it's a good argument. Why you have taken it is also furthered by the predicament that you are in and we are in, and that is the echo chamber of South Asianists, because the argument of Munis Farooqi, Pakistani, good scholar, Cambridge scholar, good book. What is his argument? He followed from Chicago school, Muzaffar Alam and all these people. He argues that it is good to have internecine fights. Brothers were fighting, Aurangzeb is fighting Murad and Murad is fighting this. It is good because that is how empire is strengthened and expanded. Now, does it not counterintuitive? Does it not counter common sense? Because one of, as greatest historian Jadunath Sarkar to R.A.R. Kulkarni to Indu Banga to Irfan Habib to me and to lay scholar like you and Madhuri, everyone we know from school time we have been writing that one of the reasons for Mughals' decline is the fighting between the brothers. And why the fighting? Because there was no law of primogeniture. The elder would succeed was not there, and that actually explains how the Mughals and preceding Mughals, the Mongols, were no longer there. Mongolia is just outer Mongolia somewhere there, supported by China and Russia. No, it's a small, and Mongols once ruled the whole world. So there are issues of historical context. In this, therefore, you are very well taking that argument to bolster your own argument that this is how princes were given this state apparatus, and that apparatus of empire becomes weaker when it faces a very big challenge like the British challenge. Absolutely agreed. But I have to put forward these defenses of our historical scholarship, because we cannot accept that. Because if you accept that, then you have to understand that Mughal history differently than all our scholars have written. Because had there be primogeniture, law of primogeniture, we would have a different ball game altogether. So resting the argument here, I found fascinating the way you have used the visuals. And that is, which adds to, I wanted some more, but I next book, maybe if you write the third book, say, because second one has been recommended already by Professor Banga, I'm recommending a third one to write on the visuals that British Museum and Library have, because our scholars cannot reach there, because per photographs is around £100. And one of my colleagues wanted to publish a book. He could not because he doesn't have that much of money. So this is the new politics of access to resources. Your book is about source criticism. This is the most important question that I wanted to raise. You wanted to anchor the book, your own argument thesis, around source criticism. That sources that the British, for example, British sources, and initially you used Suri's text, and you're trying to critique that. Being a historian, you're critiquing. And that is, I think, our bread and butter is source criticism. Either we find new sources, and now with the South Asianist world that has been created with Dipesh Chakra, Chicago and Harvard and all, there's a voyeurism about sources, because they have sources available in their libraries, their archives. Poor guys in Patiala, he had to go to the archives, archive is locked. So we have our own predicament. So we do with our sources, and we do seriously. Okay, we don't have too much of sources. On the other hand, there's too much of sources, Sanjay Subra. So now if you read them, they're all talking about sources. After a point, I ask you, what are the questions they're asking? There's no question. If you say, what is your question? Then they will say, you are a Jainu historian, you are Irfan Habib, you are Bipin Chandra, you are left and secular, so all. But the question never emerged. But you are asking a question. And question is that whether in those sources that you have, the British sources, is embedded a gendered prism. Is it gendered sources, gendered biases, prejudices, which we all agree, and you have done it so well. But as Professor Banga has pointed out, we see the sources, but we see the sources at the help of our gurus. Thankfully, you have 10 gurus. I have just one, Bipin Chandra, so who told me to go to the sources, check, because every secondary sources, as Professor Banga told you, that howlers, mistakes after mistakes. He said every footnote account. So we go to primary sources by reading the secondary sources, and all the secondary sources of the theoretical argument that you have developed actually do not allow you to source criticize. The source criticism does not come into fruition, and therefore sometimes you yourself gets into the same force. For example, simple, because this is core of your argument, and this is a beautiful argument that you are making, and I am. For example, in page numbers after numbers, page number 64, you have used exactly where the Lucknow historians of UP have so far, and so many works have come up, how the Tawayaf, the very idea of Tawayaf, has in the British way and the way it has been vulgarized, has been reduced to just nautch girls. Tawayaf become just a dancing girl. Now, unfortunately, since you were supposed to critique those terms, you yourself started using that unconsciously. So this is what we do sometimes. I also do it quite often. For example, Tawayaf, class of dancing girls and courtesans. Now, the mistake is again done in the next, because like Mai Nakan, the dancing girl turned queen. Now, when we are bringing what in the gender studies we call it recuperative history, which people have not done and I'm doing, then I have to be slightly empathetic to my sources and empathetic to the way I treat them. Now, two dancing, earlier we have called them Tawayaf, and now they have become Rani. Now, again, I'm using the word Makain, the dancing girl turned queen. So I am perpetuating that, and later on, when we are treating you, Rani Jind Kaur, the author herself starts speaking in those categories. For example, war. So it is because we have not distanced ourselves with the kind of theoretical secondary literature into looking at the primary literature in the primary job that you task yourself to do. So it's a beautiful work that you have done, source criticism. And therefore, this issue of Suris, the critiquing Suris, and later on critiquing the British reports of the 1840s and and 30s and 40s would have given you one more chapter. And I'm just seeing that the chapter is increasing into a book, into a very fascinating account of why is it that the Sikh, which or the Sardars, and I won't say Sikhs, that identity is not even in that sense coming that prominently. Why is it that the British is here, and you have shown how they were having some connection, particularly Satluj states, the Sardars were having connection with the British, and why? And then after 1857, which in your book does not happen, but India it had happened. So 1857 happened, and a new equation when the Sardars become the martial race and the supporter of the empire, and now a large number of them live in Britain and Canada and all. Now, what happens in this pre-57, which prevented a social mingling of the kind which Muhammad Farooqi, Professor Farooqi, who died, Professor Ravel Singh will correct me, in his beautiful novel, which talks about the intermingling in the 19th century of the British and the locals, so Delhi, Punjab become. So what happens that and only you can bring in, because you have beautifully brought in the 1830s and spectacle, the visuals, and you have also brought in, Priya has actually shown us the Catholic world of a Ranjit Singh Maharani's chamber, where the Krishna and all these icons are, the paintings are adorning. So this is a different world than what the world nowadays that is being projected to us as being absolutely compartmentalized. So that world does not exist. Priya brings us a kind of, I won't say multilateral culture, because that will be too narrow, a large universe in which people lived in this strategic border area, the frontier area, so to say. And in that, therefore, what happens with the British coming, meeting? So why didn't it develop in that way? And with this, I rest my case. It's a wonderful book. And I hope you come out of the echo chamber, come to Indian History Congress, where Professor Banga is the vice president and president. see how Indian historians debate and discuss with everything and break the echo chamber. It will be fantastic work that that we are awaiting the next book of yours after reading this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Batabyal, for this very thought-provoking exposition. You have also pointed out the promises and mistakes and the predicaments. One thing is for sure that with both the panelists, the spectacle part has been really appreciated. And whatever else, Dr. Atwal, the best part is that you have suggestions for your next two books here now, and we would surely like to discuss them here. And of course, the echo chambers have to be broken for that before we move on to that. So a very well articulated and informed address, Professor Batabyal. And we are, of course, fortunate that our author, Dr. Priya Atwal, is also with us today. And Dr. Atwal is a historian of the empire, monarchy, and cultural politics across Britain and South Asia. She is currently Oxford's new Community History Fellow. And Dr. Atwal has previously taught history at King's College London and at Oxford, where she obtained her doctorate degree as well. She works actively in the field of public history, presents and appears in documentaries made by the BBC. And most recently, she has presented the BBC Radio 4 series, Lies My Teacher Told Me. She also does consultation for exhibitions at Kensington Palace and other UK museums. And Royals and Rebels, The Rise and Fall of the Sikh Empire is her first book, and it is based on her doctoral research, as we mentioned earlier. And her research has been featured in collaborative projects with historic royal palaces, among others. I would request you, Dr. Atwal, to share with us what led you to the topic. I'm quite impressed that even as a third generation diaspora, she still has come back to her roots to explore them. And we would like to talk about your experiences and emotional impact of this journey, if any, the rigor and the effort that went into it as you set out to retrace history of the Sikh Empire and the role and impact of the lesser known gender, what Simone de Beauvoir calls the second sex, in the building of and nurturing of the empire, as you have narrated. And the mic is all yours now.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chawla, and to Professor Banga and Professor Batabyal and Professor Dr. Mohinder Singh. I'm blown away by all those remarks. How long do I have to respond? I don't want to take up too much time. I'd love to leave more time for questions.
Is it okay to have 15 minutes? 15 to 20 minutes?
Okay, I don't want to take that long, I must admit, okay, but it felt like a repeat of my PhD viva, but to do it over YouTube and with Dr. Manmohan Singh Ji listening to this is another level of pressure. But thank you so much. I'm honestly honoured and really grateful for all the feedback and the really thoughtful engagement with my work. I was scribbling down notes as you were as you were speaking, and it's given me a lot of food for thought. And I'm glad you think that you would like to read a second and a third book, and that there's material in there for those. So thank you for that, and that you enjoyed this one. To respond to Dr. Chawla's questions just now, and then I'll blend in my response to your comments. Yeah, I was born and brought up in England. You can hear it from my accent. I came across this through a student Sikh society talk at university when I was 18, 19. There has been, I must admit, and I'm sure you can see it in the writing of the start of the book, in many respects, my primary audience was not fellow scholars. It was not necessarily historians either. Although, of course, as a young early career academic, I was looking to write for my field and everything else. In my mindset, it was for young people like myself who would want to understand this history and have an accessible entry point, but one that also challenges us to think about the cultural richness of this period of history, not only in Punjab, but its connections to the wider subcontinent in greater depth, and to challenge some of the lionization of the Sher Punjab, and to bring out that universe of characters and culture that Rakesh mentioned in his comments. So I hope I succeeded in doing that. But I also did, and I do value the scholarship that has come from all sides on this period of history. And I mentioned that in my introduction, that I realized that I very much stand on the shoulders of giants. And I apologize if I've made any mistakes in the usages and the language and that kind of thing. You really try not to do these things, and you really try to kind of be careful with the language that you use, but obviously mistakes still happen. So thank you for that. And if there is a second edition, I don't know what the plan is yet. I will very much think about that and discuss that with the editors. So thank you on that one. In terms of the journey with the book, Professor Banga mentioned that it was a really broad canvas, and certainly I've always felt that. And I was nervous about, going for such a broad gambit. I hope it's not, that could be a reductionist approach. And I never made it to Lahore, for example, to do the research. I had some personal health issues all the way through while I was doing my PhD, and my supervisor at Oxford, Professor Faisal Devji, always encouraged me to go to Punjab. But I never made it, unfortunately, because of my own personal reasons. But I was very fortunate to benefit from a lot of support from particularly Pakistani scholars on the ground. And I wish I had managed to make contact with Professor Banga, particularly before writing this book rather than afterwards. But I read a lot of your work in the library, and I was, I learned a lot from it. And you know that it's mentioned in the book with the work of Professor Garawal as well. So I think I agree with this point about the echo chamber and the division between the schools of history, and perhaps events like this are going to be really crucial to bringing more of a connection. Sorry, was there something you wanted to say? I saw someone waving their hand there, so did Professor Banga want to say something?
I said square.
Banga,
Yes, please.
you want to say something?
No, sorry. Oh, no, please go on.
Okay.
No, the battery was running. Was running low, and I wanted to switch it on.
Okay, no worries. I'll keep my comments short then, shall I?
No, take your time.
What was I saying? Yeah, so the echo chamber part, I appreciate that, and that's a really interesting point to make. And I mean, we can only break these things down if we listen to each other and we choose to engage. So, and I'm really happy to have this kind of conversation. I feel the Zoom has done a brilliant thing for us to connect us in this way. And I hope these kind of conversations continue, because I know it will only enrich my work further. I mean, we don't have to agree on everything. And that makes for a rich debate. And I think that's also a very big problem that we have in the politics of today, is that people just tend to isolate themselves into echo chambers, and whether it be on matters of history or politics or culture or religion, rather than having a polite and informed and considered conversation. So this has been really helpful to me. One thing I was a bit perhaps disappointed, but also like fine. I may be surprised. This is the first event where I've been told that I stayed too close to the line of Khushwant Singh and Patwant Singh, when of course in the first chapter I do actively, everywhere else people have said, oh, you really went for them, you really critiqued and unpacked their work. So Professor Banga's pulled me up there on a few things, but I genuinely did want to bring another, on the point of the Maharaja dating in the 1801. That's an interesting point, and I will look at that further. I was basing this off an incident that Sohan Nasuri records in the Umdat-ut Tabarik about the anointment of the Maharaja in a ceremony. And you're right, I was itching to go and look at the book behind me on the shelf to think about it, but I will look at that more closely. But in terms of the materiality, in terms of the language, in the correspondence that he has with the British, Maharaja Ranjit Singh I'm talking about now, with the British and that kind of thing. But in terms of, yes, the material culture, particularly of this period, I think it's undeniable that he takes on this royal aspect and that he passes that on. But I think, and I made it clear that first chapter is all based on secondary literature. I did not have the skills or the time or the capacity to tread over that really important period of history in a new way. But nevertheless, the question of this weird, conundrum that we have in some aspects of Sikh popular history, right, and particularly Khushwant Singh, that the Maharaja wasn't interested in being a Maharaja, or that he wasn't interested in presenting the family as a dynasty and the rule of this kind of apparatus. I have to challenge that. And I think, Professor Banga, you even made the argument in your book on agrarian politics that Ranjit Singh is interested in a monarchical style, and that the idea of the Sarkari Khalsa is a very fluid one. And I think that speaks to the very interesting creative nature of political thought in that period and what the Sikhs were doing as a minority in the Punjab, but as we know, still with the very fluid, porous boundaries between religious communities in that period of time. And so, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Rakesh, you made the point about the politics of today. I was writing this, it was my undergraduate thesis that I started writing in, when was it now? 2011. And then my PhD thesis that I wrote in 2013 to 17. So well before the current situation. But when your book goes out in the world, this is my first book, so I've gone on a bit of a journey with it myself as a newcomer in this kind of thing. It's amazing what resonances it picks up, and the life that it takes on of its own. And I think we are in a very interesting moment in the history, in our politics of writing history once again. And it's funny because you mentioned the farmer protests, the Kisan movement right now. But oddly enough, in the UK and in the US and Canada, where it's being published by Oxford University Press, it's been co-opted into the Black Lives Matter movement, and people seeking to undercover and learn more about global histories of empire and people of color and that kind of thing. And I've never imagined a book about the Sikh Empire to fall into that space. So it's really interesting to take this on board and to think about this. And that comes to the point about empires and colonialism. I completely understand what you're saying, Rakesh, about not wanting to collapse the term and then making it kind of empty and usable in lots of different ways. I think we cannot forget that the nature of the East India Company's politics in India was a completely on another order of magnitude in violence, in piracy, in its mobilization of capitalism, is as this complete machine of disruption and destruction. That is not what the Maharaja was doing, his family were doing. And I completely take Professor Banga's point about the periodization. I was striving to make that point that this kingdom is on the cusp of these things. I hope perhaps I didn't make it clearly or eloquently or strongly enough. So thank you for that, and I can think about that for the future. But that's where I see Dalip Singh as this really interesting linchpin figure. And actually, he's where I was thinking of going with my next book. But if you've given me a couple of other ideas, I can think about those too. Because I think actually his journey and how he comes to his rebellion later on is still caught up with the politics of royal identity and of princely identity. And he is still trapped in this more kind of, whatever you want to say it, however you want to say it, medieval, early modern idea of kingship. But he gets even more confused because he lands up in Britain. And he's very much welcomed by Queen Victoria and encouraged to see himself as royal. But the British colonial government is not going to let him have that status. They want to see him rubbed away, his family line rubbed away. And that is part of this change, right? I mean, I think also the history of empire is also going through a new phase, and it's entered this kind of domain of popular debate. But empires have predominated throughout world history, not just and the British Empire, of course, is at a new moment of being challenged and debated. And in the UK, it's a whole other ballgame. We come at it with this weird sort of balance sheet. Was it good or bad? Which is a complete nonsense. But at the same time, we're trying to grapple with considering different kinds of empires and how they operate. So I think the field of empire as a whole is something that we need to have a more lively debate about comparatively, without shying away from the fact that we can see the Sikh rulers, the dynasty, and yes, I get it. Even I have this confusion. Do we call them the Sikh rulers? Do we call them the Punjabi rulers? What do we call them? And that was something I battled with my editor throughout this whole process. And she was encouraging me to go with one thing, and I said, no, we can't. And so you have a hodgepodge. But even that, I think, even I feel free. I'm surprised you didn't call me up on this, because, you know, I use the term Sikh Empire. That's a modern term. That's not in the sources of the period either. So I've had to take that for some sort of argumentation, but also convenience. Every part of this you could challenge. And so I'm really glad that you have given me this feedback. But I think on the whole, what I would say is there were lots of themes within the book: the gender aspect, the question about empire history, and the question of how we write this history, that I wanted to put out as an experiment. So thank you for taking me up on that. And I hope it continues to develop a new debate. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atwal. Thankful to you and appreciative that you made us privy to your valuable experiences and encounters in the making of the book. And
Dr. Singh has to thank and announce.
Yes, sir. I just want to thank Dr. Atwal and congratulate her. She has, I think, well defended her thesis.
Not getting a new PhD.
Her PhD viva, sir. I hand over to Dr. Singh now for his observations and to announce the upcoming book.
Thank you, Madhuri. We are enlightened today. I think this is one of the best book discussion we had till today. Very precisely discussed merits and demerits of the books. Thank you, Mr. Professor Rakesh Batabyal and Professor Indu Banga ji. And thanks to author also, Priya Atwal, for giving this opportunity to us to discuss this book. And thanks to Madhuri ji also. My heartiest thanks to Dr. Manmohan Singh ji also, who has joined this program with us online. We are having 2 programs per month. In this month, we are having a lecture in our lecture series on 26th June, the contribution of artists highlighting exemplary life of Guru Tegh Bahadur ji. Speaker is Mrs. Sonia Dhami from USA, and Ambassador Ashok Sajanhar will chair this program. This will be held at 11 a.m. Indian Standard Time. And the next book's discussion is a Punjabi book, a poetry book by Dr. Manmohan, Kalpabrik. And panelists are Dr. Professor Yogaraj Angrish from Punjab University, Chandigarh, and Tirsaj Kali, a veteran journalist in Punjabi. Next month, we are having lecture series, and The lecturer is Guru Tegh Bahadur, Martyrdom, Professor
Sukhdev Singh.
Professor Sukhdayal Singh from Punjab University, Patiala will be delivering this lecture, and Professor Bhagwan Joshi will preside over this, chair this function. So thank you to all of you for today. We shall meet on 26th June. All are requested to rejoin us on that day at
11 a.m.
11 a.m. in the morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Grateful to all of you.
Yeah.
Our Jathedar.
Yeah, very good.
Very good.
Thank you.
I don't have any photographs because
Achha, you got the first one. Priya,
No.
you have to replace this book.
No, but the bookseller said the publisher took back all the copies. Then I insisted and they